Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining tonight. My name is Ron Robertson. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Picmonic. And, I actually started Picmonic as a third-year medical student after I had taken step one. And so to some extent, I understand the pain firsthand of trying to become a healthcare professional and how much information you have to learn and retain and, a lot of the daunting challenges of becoming, a doctor. And, my problem was definitely remembering the information, which is what led to the creation of Picmonic, using, pictures and stories to help me retain the information. And that, fast forward now 7 years, I'm kind of at the helm and lead Picmonic's mission to help students make learning the impossible possible. Now, that's just a very small glimpse into kind of who I am and why I'm here. But today, it's an honor to present and have an opportunity to chat with Chris Tenore. So Chris, welcome and thank you for joining.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And so everybody, Chris is a very unique guest here on our webinar series today. And we're going to be talking about several things. But first and foremost, Chris absolutely crushed step one. He got a 268, which is legendary. And he's got a lot of advice and tidbits and pearls that he's going to hopefully share with us in the next hour. So before we jump in, Chris, where did you go to medical school? Where are you right now in residency? Just catch people up to speed real quick on some of those details.
Yeah, sure. So from New York originally, I did medical school at Albert Einstein in the Bronx, New York. And now I'm up at Yale New Haven Hospital in Connecticut for pediatric residency. So I'm a third-year resident, about to finish. And I'll be going on to a clinical informatics fellowship 2 years down at Sinai in Manhattan.
Which is phenomenal. So congrats to your success thus far.
Thanks.
Third-year resident at Yale, by no means, that's just impressive as is. And ultimately, to get you to where you are today, I know there's been some hurdles and challenges, and learned a lot, not just as far as the information, but about how to do things, how to learn, and how to study more effectively and efficiently. So, we'd love to take some time today, pick your brain a little bit, and give you an opportunity to share those pearls of wisdom with, the hundreds of thousands of students around the country who can hopefully benefit from your knowledge. So let's go ahead and jump right in. I think we want to talk first and foremost about step one. It's kind of the beast, right, of medical school. You get in, and for the first couple of years, it's the looming giant. So tell me a little bit about your experience with step one. Possibly, and we had an opportunity to talk for a little bit beforehand. So I know that your school made some recommendations, and that kind of led to some research and literature that you ended up participating in. But tell me about ultimately your experience with step one.
Yeah. So for just to normalize it, step one is pretty much the worst part of medical school. So don't feel bad if you guys are struggling or freaking out. It's totally normal. And just take a breath because everyone gets through it. So for me, it was really helpful so our medical school had something called the Step One group, which was a peer-run organization. It was older students who would help the younger students who were about to take the exam. It would give them sort of objective advice and study strategies. So we had that in place, which was super helpful. And I'll be speaking a lot through that lens because I ended up being one of the co-leaders during my third and fourth year, and we ended up developing a pretty extensive sort of study strategy, I guess you'd call it, program. And with the school, we ended up studying our results. So we got, numbers of all the medical students, anonymized what their medical school test scores were, what their step one scores were, what types of resources they used for step one, and when they started. So lots of different information. And we were able to look at all that and figure out what seems to be working best for people and what doesn't. So that's sort of where I came from after going through it myself, and then sort of moving into more of a teaching position and an analytical position of trying to find out what works, what strategies work best, and what to focus on.
So let's make sure that everybody understands what we just said. Number one, you nailed step one. You got a 268, which is phenomenal. But then you actually helped to lead the peer group at your institution, at your medical school, that helped make recommendations to other students, but did this in an analytical way, actually doing research around step one test scores. So numerous different points here, and that research was published, right? We can actually share that afterwards as well. But so let's break it down. And maybe we can run this in parallel based on the recommendations of the research that you guys published, but also kind of how you took this down yourself and through your journey. What did you actually do? Let's start with, when did you start studying for STEP?
So I started a little bit earlier just because I didn't really know what to expect, as a second year. Obviously I was nervous, so I probably started looking into Q banks and stuff around October, November, but not really committing to it, being very inconsistent with my work. But I would try to do, like I don't know, 3 or 4 questions a night, like nothing significant, and then really started ramping up around January. And then it sort of comes in phases with your classwork. So I would, I recommend definitely prioritizing classwork as well. So I would study a little less for STEP during, January to March. Then once spring break hit, I amped up a little bit more, then slowed down again. And then finally, our school had a dedicated study period, towards the end. And obviously you're doing a lot more studying at that point.
So, and when did you actually take your exam? Because I know a lot of institutions take them at different points in time. So was yours like a May, June timeframe, or?
Yeah, it's like a mid-June. I think it was like June 20th or something.
Okay. And how long was that dedicated STEP time? How many weeks did you actually go intensive studying?
So the dedicated was about 6 weeks, but I was probably pushing myself for, I would say, the last like 8 weeks, or 8 to 10 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you said you actually started doing question banks in October, November, December, and kind of lightly ramped up. So first semester, second year, lightly ramped up on the Q banks. And let's just jump right in then to the resources that you used, because question banks are obviously a core asset in the arsenal. So tell me, what question banks did you use? Uh-oh. I think we might have just lost Greg.
Oh, wait.
Yeah, you disappeared. I can't see you. You're back.
I'm back.
So tell me a little bit about the question banks that you used in your journey.
Cool. So in terms of Q banks, I stuck with, so first I actually got Kaplan. I ended up focusing heavily on UWorld. And then beyond, those were the main 2 that I used, and our school had some less useful ones that were free that I didn't do much with. So I focused heavily on UWorld, and then secondarily on Kaplan. And then in terms of what my recommendations are as a mentor, I pretty much highly recommend UWorld as the #1 resource. So it's super high yield. The explanations are amazing. I tell students to sort of treat the explanations like its own textbook. So if you imagine all the explanations combined, it's basically another textbook, and the explanations are so good. The way the questions are written, the stuff you'll see, it's very high yield, and there's obviously some medium and low mixed in, but overall, I would, in my opinion, it's the highest yield resource. One goal I suggest to students is, as much as you can, try to finish UWorld 2 times through. And it's super daunting, it's really scary, but the closer you can get to that 2 times through, the more you're going to retain all those questions. The first pass through is sort of overwhelming, a lot of information, but that second pass through really starts to solidify what you learned, and also you're not struggling through those explanations as much anymore. And then in terms of, I get obviously asked a lot about other Q banks, and in my opinion, after UWorld, like prioritize UWorld, and then after that, I would only pick maybe 1 other Q bank and stick with that. I don't recommend any one in particular, whichever one to you seems the most relevant to the UWorld content, but pick 1 other one, and then once you've finished as much UWorld as you think is good for you, then I would move on to that secondary one, but only after you feel pretty comfortable with the UWorld content. So that's usually what I recommend.
Yeah, I have to ask too, because I hear a lot of people saying that they'll do Kaplan in, let's say, the first half of second year, even first year leading up to second year, and then really in the 6 months before step time, that they'll really focus on UWorld. So you're saying, crush UWorld once, do it again, and if you have time, maybe throw in a third or a second QBank, but really focus heavily on UWorld.
Yeah, so when we look at the data, what we see. Yeah, go ahead.
No, please. You're talking data.
Yeah.
You get the mic.
The first big thing we saw was that January seemed to be the sweet spot for starting step prep. Students who started earlier didn't score better than the students who started in January, and the ones who started later potentially were doing a bit worse. So January really seemed to be that sweet spot.
Okay, that's good.
And then another big thing we found was that number of questions completed seemed to be one of the most important predictors of score. So you could look at students who did, all of UWorld and then 1,000 or more extra questions, or UWorld and 1,000 less questions. And those kids who had a higher number of questions tended to do better. So, and other people have looked at this before as well. So it's unclear if it's what the specific questions are, where they come from, or if it's just sheer number of questions, but getting through those questions is super important.
And how many questions did you do? Just so for context, you said you did UWorld twice, so we're saying like there's 2,000 questions, ends up being like 4,000 questions total, or?
Yeah, so 4,000 total, and you end up, honestly, on that second run through, you're usually going pretty quick. So you're cutting your time down on a block to 30 minutes to an hour. You're skipping a lot of easy questions, so you're breezing through. So it's not nearly as painful as the first time.
Okay. And the only other thing that I want to kind of elicit with this too, at least talking about question banks, is this kind of ties to time management and stamina as well, but were you doing, especially leading up in your dedicated step prep time, were you doing chunks of, 45, 45, 45? How many actual sets of questions were you doing leading up to it? Did you take many full-length practice exams in the form of QBanks? And I don't know, it's kind of I'm going to let you just take it.
Yeah. All super common questions that we get a lot. I'll just quickly, for the standardized tests, or the prep tests, I actually only took one and I didn't find it very useful. It varies by students, because some students really love it and they love the confidence. But for me, like the NBME ones that I've seen weren't nearly as predictive of what the test was like as even UWorld itself. So for me, I still just recommend focusing on the UWorld, but some students really like the practice test, so I don't really comment one way or another. I just say, like, try one and see if you like it. And then the other question about doing blocks. So I would typically sit down and do blocks in a row, and I recommend that, it's always good to just sit down and do the straight block. There's a lot of stuff to mention. So people ask a lot about how many blocks to do per day, kind of thing.
Right.
I usually say in January, in January, you're probably doing 20 questions a day, 10, 20 questions a day, starting real slow. By the dedicated study period, when you're trying to really go hard with UWorld, you're probably doing 3 or 4 blocks a day, and that's including reading and studying explanation. So it's sort of time consuming. Yeah.
So I know there's other parts of question banks that I kind of want to tap into, but I want to do it in kind of concert with some of the other resources as well. So let's talk about some of the other key resources, and first just list them off, and then let's dive in a little bit to the different things that you use.
Sure. So we break it up by resource type. So first, we talk about textbooks. So obviously, first aid is like the holy grail. One piece of advice I give is it's only in your benefit to know as much of first aid as possible. And that's another really scary statement. And it's pretty much impossible is the kicker. but as much as you can get of that first aid in, it is a really high yield resource. So that's why I
So
usually say
memorize
prioritize.
first aid.
Yeah, that it's impossible to do, but just
Yeah.
always remembering that as much of that as you could get in, the better. Because, and it's not even like a particularly well written resource, but unfortunately they will, I've seen questions asked on a lot of the stuff in there. So as much as you can within reason, try to get as much first aid in as possible. So first aid's one text. There's like pathoma text. Golion has a text which is a little too wordy and low yield, so I usually don't recommend that. The BRS series stuff I usually recommend just for students struggling with a particular subject, obviously. So I wouldn't recommend going through the whole series. I would just say, if you're having trouble with embryology, then pick up that one, but don't read a whole BRS book. Just read small sections. Then we talk about Q banks, which we already mentioned. I always focus on audio and visual resources as another category, which I think is maybe a little bit undervalued. So there's like Golion lectures, there's like the Pathoma lectures, and then what I love about Picmonic actually is we have educational audios for all of our Picmonics, which will just talk you through just the educational parts of the Picmonic, and it has really great it's just high yield facts listed one after another. So having those audios to listen to when you're free time is super important, like washing the dishes or at the gym, just having something on in the background. You'll be surprised how much you actually end up retaining. And then the last thing would be like the commercial test prep products, like the DIT and stuff like that. We never really gave an opinion one way or another on those. It's sort of like those test prep MBME ones. Some people swear by it, some people it doesn't work for. So it's the sort of thing you got to do your research and talk to people and see if it's for you. But those are the big categories.
Okay, so let me jump in. So really, when we talk textbooks, we're looking at first aid as kind of the gold standard, right? We've got question banks, which we're saying UWorld. And then other resources or audiovisual resources where you mentioned kind of like a Pathoma, Picmonic. Which of the audiovisual resources did you use? Obviously, you used first aid for textbook. What in the audiovisual realm did you use?
So I focused heavily on the Golion lectures, which I don't even know if they're available for like purchase or if it's just sort of like handed between students, because that's how I got my lectures.
Just the audio lectures, or was there actually videos?
Yeah, so the ones that we had circulating was just audio. The audio is all you need. But I have students who use the Pathoma videos and they'll just sort of listen to them. But for me, it was the Golion in particular.
Okay. And so did you actually use Picmonic for step 1 or step 2?
Yeah, for both.
So tell me a little bit about your experience with Picmonic. It's funny, a lot of students, when we talk to them, a lot of people use it very different. Whether they're using it with, let's say, to complement first aid, they're learning a topic in first aid, and then they're referencing, Picmonic actually has the pages listed of first aid. We reference first aid, so you could go to that topic and then watch the Picmonic, which is going to kind of place those memory anchors in your brain so that you have that bullet point list memorized, right? Versus other people will do questions, and if they get a question wrong, then they'll go to Picmonic to make sure that they lock that in. So how did you use Picmonic in your studies and in concert with some of these other resources?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that I love Picmonic, and the reason I'm here the reason I'm here right now, I'm here right now. As you remember, I reached out to you last year just because I love the product and I just wanted to get involved again. So I always recommend Picmonic when students ask me about advice. So basically, it's just, even if you don't think you're an audiovisual learner, I always tell people to first just get on and get the free trial. And what I've said to myself when I was a second year student, I was a little bit skeptical, and I was like, all right, I'll look at these 10 Picmonics, and if I remember them next week, then I'm gonna buy the subscription. And,
Yeah.
1 week later, of course, I remembered all of it, and I was like, all right, I have to get it because it's just so efficient. Um, so I highly recommend it for all students at least to check out, and I think it'll work for a lot of people. I started using it throughout the whole school year, starting around in January, and I would use it with my classwork for if there was like a really difficult disease or difficult topic that I was having trouble with. And then I ramp up a lot when like during the spring break and during the dedicated period, I would have like just Picmonic time during the day. So probably like 30 minutes to an hour where I would just go through the really high yield Picmonic systems. And by that I mean
Yeah. Let's
Picmonic
explain
for
that.
me is, yeah, so Picmonic for me is even more useful than anything else for the really nitpicky, really complex step one topics. So, you've got your like metabolic diseases, all those weird pediatric syndromes, genetic disorders. Then you've got pharmacology, microbiology. A lot of these topics that students have a lot of trouble remembering. They probably didn't hear much about it in their regular medical school courses.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there's just such a huge volume of information. It's really hard to commit all these nitpicky disorders to memory. So for me, whenever I would always have Picmonic open studying those sections, and then any other section where I was having trouble with a particular topic or disorder, I'd be referencing it.
That's great. And definitely, I know, it's for me remembering the microbiology, a lot of pharmacology where it's not to say rote memorization, but it felt like rote memorization, and you're trying to keep those nuanced details. I've said this before, it's actually like the lysosomal storage diseases in biochem. That was the set of trying to remember sphingomyelinase, aryl sulfatase, beta-glucocerebrosidase. It was just like, there wasn't a lot of deep information there that we actually needed to know, but we had to know the nuanced facts. And so, actually
Exactly.
creating pictures in these stories made it, for me, incredibly simple. And that was kind of the impetus to starting Picmonic. But love to see that it worked. So you used Picmonic for step one. And so with first aid or with UWorld or with did you use Pathoma, or it was more Golion on
I
the
didn't
audio
use
side?
Pathoma actually. Yeah, it was Golion, but people have success with Pathoma too. So I never pick one or the other usually for when I'm
Yeah, yeah,
making
yeah.
recommendations.
And I have to ask because a lot of people think about most of these resources as just step one or test prep resources. Um, do you know, either did you or other students use Picmonic actually in first year? Because we hear a lot of students saying one of their biggest regrets is not using it earlier,
Hmm.
or that they actually end up using it into step two or even residency. Has it helped you in your journey and beyond? I mean, for where you're at now?
Oh yeah, for sure. I still, to this day, when I'm on the floors getting like pimped by someone, or I still remember the Picmonics in my head. And I'll go back and like refresh my memory because it's just the fastest way to remember. Students ask me a lot about using it in first year, and I always say just go for it. It's the same learning platform that it's going to be. If it's going to work for you, it's going to work, and it's
Right.
super efficient. So if there's relevant topics on there and you're struggling, earlier in med school, then yeah, go for it.
That's great. That's great advice. So, I mean, if we had to kind of consolidate some of this advice, and maybe even if, well, I kind of wanted to consolidate and say, so if you had to boil it down to a couple key tips, um, you know, use UWorlds, do it multiple times. First aid is obviously a core resource in the Bible. Try and memorize as much as possible. Use audio-visual resources or things that are going to help really supplement that learning and help you retain it. So a Goliana, Pathoma, Picmonic. Um, what am I missing here? Give me some more advice that everyone, all our listeners, we got tons of people watching this now.
Yeah.
What else can they take away as kind of key points?
Yeah, so everything you said is right. Starting in January, I usually recommend starting slow and then ramping up during times when you
Saw that.
starting slow, ramping up when you can, and then having, I give those goals that I mentioned, they're very intimidating and they're lofty, and you definitely don't have to get there, but it's sort of, that it's just a goal to have, and it's just an idea that something that you could try to get to, and if you can't make it there, that's fine, and most, the majority of people do perfectly fine without hitting those goals. So
Right.
um, what else? Don't forget about your regular schoolwork. So keep up with that during, the whole, January to June. If you, God forbid, if you fail a medical school test or you do real bad, that's going to cause you a lot of problems in the coming months that might detract from your step studying. So you really want to keep up with your classwork and with your other medical school duties. Um, we also looked at medical school test scores in step one, and they also tended to correlate. So it's probably just because we're looking at a student population that just happens to be very diligent with their studying. So it's probably a little
Right.
biased, but um, it's always good to keep up with your tests, your schoolwork. Um, let's see. Yeah,
I
those
have
are
a
like
question
the
about
real big
first aid
points.
too. You have a question about first aid because, when I was in medical school, I didn't buy first aid my first year. I didn't get it until second year. A lot of students that we talk to nowadays are getting first aid as soon as they start, and they're trying to review and annotate along the way. Is that something that, based on your studies or research, you found one way or the other to be helpful or not?
Yeah, for annotation you're talking about?
Yeah, even just reviewing it so that you're familiar with the text, because a lot of, every school teaches differently, and whether they're using, PowerPoints or lectures or whatever, the course content is that you might get at your institution. Understanding how that translates into what you see in first aid, which is really going to be the boiled down, consolidated list of core facts that you need to know.
Hmm.
Um, typically what you're learning in school is going to have a lot more information surrounding it. So just reviewing it so that you familiarize yourself with it, and then definitely annotating things if necessary. Is that
Yeah, so I do recommend,
helpful? Not
yeah, during second year, I definitely recommend going through using first aid with your classwork when
okay.
applicable,
Yep.
um, but not going crazy with it. If you're focusing on your test work, focus on what you need to know, um, and look it up in first aid if it's there, but then don't get sucked down the first aid, wormhole and lose focus of the test you're studying for school. In terms of first aid, like during first year, uh, we never really talked about that too much, but personally, I would probably stay away from that just because it's a lot of content that
Okay.
you're not going to really have any exposure to yet during first year, maybe towards the end of first year, but I wouldn't stress too much about step one during your first year medical school. I would just focus on your work, and you'll learn most of what you need to know during second year.
Okay. So I want to do a couple things for our audience here today. Number one is I want to remind everybody that they can go to the webinar chat widget and questions, and you can actually write in. And Chris, we're going to ask him some of these here in a minute. So I see some of you doing that, and we're going to get to them. We're not ignoring you guys. So please feel free to ask questions. And before we go there, I just wanted to ask one other thing about kind of step one and time management. It's something that you and I've talked a little bit about, but I just want to kind of get your take on how did you manage your time? Was there anything that you did, tips or tricks that you can convey for time management in medical school, studying for STEP, or just in general, to be as successful as you are? You definitely have figured something out. All of us feel like we never have enough time to take on what's in front of us. So do you have any tips there?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just about work-life balance, right? So it's about, um, you know, working as hard as you can and making the most of your study time when you're doing it, and then knowing your limits and taking breaks when you need them and making the most of those breaks. Um, and by breaks, I'm talking about, an hour break during studying as well as a weekend off or, a week vacation. So knowing when you need a break and knowing to take that break. And that's even more important during the dedicated study period because students get so worried and they're studying, 12, 14 hours a day with no breaks, and it's the easiest way to burn out, and you're never gonna study efficiently without taking breaks during the study period. So everyone will forget this by the time the study period comes, but remember to take your breaks. And then time management wise for med school, it's a lot of work. You just put in, I would say for, out again, come back in. Sorry about that. I would say for, January to March or till break, anytime you're just doing regular medical school classwork, you want to be doing, probably 3 to 4 hours a day of just regular studying, and then maybe 30 minutes of step prep, and then ramping up as you go, but really focusing on your schoolwork. And then time management, and then the rest of the time you're just exercising or, hanging out with friends. And then time management during the dedicated period, you're basically ramping up to, 8 to 10 hours a day, probably like 6 to 10 hours a day. And then that'll vary based on the day, obviously. But you're trying to push yourself as much as you can within reason, and you're trying to take frequent breaks so that you stay motivated. And then you're also taking days off when you need it, and you're planning, little trips or, whatever to keep you sane and focused. So yeah, but time management is definitely super important.
That makes sense. So I'm going to go ahead and ask some of the questions that look like they're popping up over here.
Cool.
Because this is an interesting question in general. A lot of people ask about memorization versus conceptual understanding. So that was one of the questions. How do you balance understanding truly the concepts that you need to know to become a healthcare professional versus just memorizing the details? And how do you kind of tease those out?
Yeah. So unfortunately, our field is a lot about memorization, just route memorization. So, different physical exam signs that are named after old physicians, that's just route memorization. And people will ask you that, and you're just going to be expected to know it. So the reality is that there's going to be route memorization, and you're just going to have to deal with it. So I accept that, and that's what I use. I think Picmonic is really great for those cases, as you were talking about, like all these enzymes and all these different biochemical pathways where there's really not much to it except it's just memorization. So sometimes you just have to accept the fact. But I do think it's really, whenever you can, try to figure out the foundation of something. So for names of enzymes, try to figure out what part of the pathway they're in to make them named that. So whenever I can, I do try to figure out why something is named that, or why, whatever I'm learning, I try to figure out why when I can. But I do also accept the fact that there is, unfortunately, a lot of route memorization.
It's an interesting balance. I think there's a lot of stuff that we had to learn that is just that. It's rote memorization, and you might not need to know the actual meaning or understanding behind it. But then there's also parts of rote memorization that can help you build a conceptual understanding. Where it's like if you can't remember some of the core details, how are you going to build an understanding off of it? And that's where, for me, Picmonic was a massive. It was almost like creating a framework that then I could fill in the details and some of the information. So, and the reason I'm asking that question too is because, did you use Picmonic after you learned a core concept or before? Different people say different things, and I want you to go ahead and answer that. And I'm gonna duck down real quick as I grab the battery cord and plug it in so the computer doesn't die and I don't disappear.
Yeah, no worries. So that's a good question. So I think exactly like you were saying, Picmonic is really good for establishing that framework. So a lot of the stuff on step 1, students get really scared because they haven't even heard of that disease, and it wasn't taught in medical school at all. So do expect that, and you're going to have to learn these diseases from scratch with no framework. So like you were saying, Picmonic is actually super useful for figuring out those terms, committing it to memory, and then once you finally have this initial framework, you can actually start to more easily delve into the disease and figure out, okay, this connects to this, because once you have that initial framework, it makes the subsequent learning a lot faster. So Picmonic is definitely great just for diving into topics you know nothing about, and then it will facilitate more natural learning just as you go. So, and then the other way around, it's really useful for diseases that you already know, because it will just increase the efficiency that you can recall that, and you'll be able to connect it to different topics a lot faster. So I did it both ways, honestly.
But no, that's interesting. Uh, have a question here about Anki or Firecracker. Did you use either of those tools? Are you familiar with them? Anything to say? And I'm
Yeah,
not trying to
so
disparage any other companies or tools. So if it's negative, maybe we don't want to go there. But
no, no, nothing negative. I get asked about a lot of like the ancillary resources, and
right,
I don't have a I don't have a stance on any of them in particular. Like I said, I think it's, I think 80% of your job is to do all that stuff we just talked about before. And then if you can tack on any additional resources, that's great, but you should really be focusing on those goals we talked about before. If you find that those resources will help you achieve those goals, then definitely do it. But in my opinion, you should prioritize what we talked about before, and then, you know, do whatever you can to help that.
so coming back to another question, when you go through UWorlds and you do the questions, how would you let's talk about more on the first pass, but would you actually, going through the rationale and the explanations, did you take notes? Or was it literally just, active reading and really trying to make sure you had a good comprehension of the material?
Yeah, so this was also, I think, probably one of the keys to my success was that I did keep a very extensive note library, and so I created a huge study guide for my sort of a rolling study guide, which basically in January I started a skeleton, and it was just, a Word document with like neurology, gastroenterology, cardiology, just different headlines.
Right.
Um, and then, like you were saying, whenever I would go through a UWorld explanation, I would just type just a couple quick words on what I learned, and the pearls from that. So I did that throughout the whole year. And, by a dedicated study period, I had this huge sort of simplified study guide of just like the most high yield things, or the things that I was least familiar with. And I kept that going through the whole study period, and actually into step 2 and step 3, because it's all still relevant. So I would just keep adding on. So I highly recommend students actually keep a rolling study guide like that going throughout the year, because repetition is basically, I mean, it's got to be one of the best forms of, solidifying memory, if not the best. So having a study guide where you can go back and see again that thing you saw once, but you're probably going to forget, super important. So I definitely recommend keeping some kind of study guide.
What you said, that repetition is critical to remembering, right? Like the whole theory of spaced repetition, and what exists in a lot of the systems nowadays is that as soon as you learn something, you start to forget it. And if you don't try and if you don't review that information or try and relearn it at some point in time, you're gonna forget it. So repetition is necessary. The question is, how do you space that out intentionally and intelligently? And the beauty is now there's a lot of systems that will help do that for you. So Picmonic has spaced repetition, Osmosis, Firecracker, Anki is another example, right, where you can plug in flashcards and then actually have intelligent algorithms that will help you review the information at the right point in time, which is when you're about to forget it, but most of us don't know that intuitively. So I'm a big fan of spaced repetition.
Yeah.
And a lot of these systems just didn't exist when I was in med school. So
Same.
So let's, we've got about 20 minutes left, and what I want to do is maybe move on. Well, if there's anything else that you want to talk about in relation to step 1, the research you guys conducted, or just, tips, tricks, I want to give you a minute to do that. And if not, I want to bounce on to a few other kind of subjects that I think you've got some great advice to share. So any last thoughts on step 1 studying prep, and, how you absolutely nailed that test?
No, we covered all of it. I mean, I'll quickly just, list the goals one more time, just so everyone has it
Please do.
succinct. So basically, as much as you can, try to get these, but don't drive yourself crazy, and always have some me time and have some break time to keep yourself sane. So studying in January, prioritizing UWorld and trying to get through it twice before exam time. getting another question bank in and doing as much of that as you can. After you feel comfortable with UWorld, more questions is better. First aid, as much as you can, getting through that, and having some kind of audio or visual resource to listen to during your downtime, and then keeping a study guide as you go to have constant refreshing of all the stuff that you're definitely going to forget.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I'm going to say that the best way to memorize first aid is by using Picmonic because we cover the majority of it. So
Yeah, exactly.
no, so that's phenomenal advice, and obviously some literature and research and data to back not only what you're saying, but your score alone says a lot. So let's talk about research in medical school because we're talking about research for a second. What's your kind of thoughts on doing it, whether you need to be published, how important it is to get a legit residency? Just 1 minute on research.
Yeah. So, medical school is super hard, obviously, because we're balancing so many different things at once. And
Yeah.
if school wasn't hard enough, they also want you to start fleshing out your resume for residency. And
Right. Yeah.
a lot of people say to take first year slow, and you should. But the unfortunate reality is that as soon as you can get on your resume, day one of medical school, that will always benefit you. So your whole career in medical school, you should always be looking for opportunities to flesh out your resume or to get in some kind of research position. Don't kill yourself during first year, obviously, there's no pressure, but if you find an opportunity, go for it. And obviously prioritizing schoolwork is most important. So research-wise, you don't necessarily need to publish, and I publish. But so a lot of people do not publish, and you do totally fine. Some people publish and they don't they don't match where they want. As long as you're in some kind of project, some kind of research project, that's what people want to see, even more and more nowadays. So I would definitely have a goal to get involved in some type of research project, whether that's basic science, clinical research, some kind of quality improvement research with your hospital, but getting involved in at least one research program, research project, I would have as one of your goals. And not necessarily publication. Publication is great, but at least being involved in at least one project for sure.
I think that's good advice. The only thing I would add on to it is because I did research throughout, but try and get involved in research that you actually care about,
Yeah.
so that it's not just padding your resume. Because at the same time, if you get in there and you start getting drilled on questions and you really weren't that passionate about what you were even involved in, it shows. So make
Yeah,
sure it's something
absolutely.
that you care about. Let's talk about extracurriculars, or for you outside of research. Were there other things that you did throughout your journey that you felt helped kind of put you ahead to get into the residency of your dreams?
Yeah, so I would definitely recommend, even outside of the research, also having some activities that you're involved in, preferably in a leadership position is what your goal is, but being involved is great from the get-go. So, our school had a student-run clinic for uninsured patients that we were able to be, sort of the primary care providers. So I was heavily involved in that. Being worked with the Step 1 group, I was doing tutoring. I was, involved in activities in the community and things with the local hospitals. So
Yeah.
as much as you can, looking for activities outside of your schoolwork. So volunteer things that are going on, clubs in your school that have a leadership position open. You should be aiming for, within reason. Don't stretch yourself out too much. But these are the things that people more and more are going to probably be wanting to see. So yeah.
That's solid. How about and I keep trying to go kind of towards the residency, right? Because nailing step one is critical. We know that. It's probably one of the paramount driver, right? But outside of step one, research, extracurriculars, letters of rec. Talk about letters of recommendation, and is that important? Is it a necessary piece of the process? What can you do to either make sure you get good letters or set yourself up for success there?
Yeah. So yeah, I should probably just pull back real quick. A lot of what we're talking about, basically, just imagine one day you're going to open up that that ERAS webpage when you're applying to residency, and there's basically just categories that you have to fill out, and the categories are like, there's a category for research activities, for volunteer activities. Then you upload your letters of rec. So one day you guys are going to be filling out all these different forms on the ERAS page, and this is what we're talking about here. So letters of rec, you're going to need them on this when you apply, and it's good to sort of make a connection with someone whenever you can, whenever you see the opportunity, whenever you're interested in the work someone's doing, or if you clicked with someone or have a project with someone, jump on those opportunities and make those relationships as strong as you can, because you're going to need that letter one day, and you're going to need to just network yourself, because that's just part of the profession. So I would say, as early in your career as you can, when you see the opportunity, go for it. Try to meet lots of different people so you're not really pigeonholing yourself, and then see who you connect with the most, or whose interests are most in line with yours, and attach yourself more to those people. And then especially during second and third year, and as you start to get more hospital time, really start to keep your eye out for mentors who are in the field you want to go into, and start to develop relationships with those people. And that could be offering help on a project they're doing, or just asking them if they have any learning opportunities that you could be involved in, just to make that relationship stronger.
That's great. That's great. How about clinicals and third year? I mean, third year and fourth year, as you're kind of talking about, the further you get along in your career. Towards the aspect, I've had different conversations with students who, a lot of people I feel like that I talk to end up regretting how they went into third year, specifically, because it's a big change from the first 2 years of medical school, right? Now you're in clerkships, and you're on the wards, and I don't want to bias this, so I just kind of want to open it up to you. Do you have any specific advice or thoughts, things that maybe you know now that you didn't know then?
Let's see.
You wish you might have done differently? Yeah,
so I would recommend, first of all, like I was just saying, the networking aspect. I definitely could have been better at networking and meeting more people, being more, willing to meet and interact with attendings, so I could have been more proactive about like finding different mentors and sort of casting a wider net. So I definitely could have been better with that, and I think it's important for you to remember as you're going through your rotations, just looking for people that you can connect with. Definitely important to have some sort of notepad on you to take high yield notes on your rotations, because you'll get swept up in the day and the busyness of the day, and you'll feel like you're not learning anything if you don't see it again, like repetition. So have some sort of notepad that you're always jotting stuff down on. And then being very open with the team and trying to be as helpful and useful as possible, because that's what's going to that's what's going to get you better relationships with people on the team, and then you're going to get better evaluations, and unfortunately you need those evaluations for residency. So meeting everyone on the team, offering help whenever you can, offering to give a small presentation on something, trying to take on extra patients, like always trying to do a little bit extra, but never trying to be overbearing, because people definitely don't like when you're like being too intense or like, too annoying, but within reason, trying to be
find the balance.
As helpful. Yeah, find a balance between being helpful and outgoing, but not trying to be a gunner or anything too abrasive to anybody.
Great advice. It's great advice. So last kind of quick question as we wrap, we're going to wrap up in probably the next five or so minutes. Again, crew online today, feel free to write in any last questions you have, and we'll try and get them real quick. But how did you choose your career? Did you come in knowing that you were going to end up where you are? Did you change decisions based on clerkships or shadowing or life experience. And do you have any advice as far as that goes?
Yeah, so I still don't have the perfect idea of where I'm going, and and everything's always, for everyone, your career is always going to be changing, and your interests are always going to be changing. And medicine's nice because really, no matter what you do, you're always in a position to kind of tweak your career, which is nice. So I would say be open-minded on your third-year rotations. Don't do anything that you don't like. So don't do anything for prestige. Really do it if you like what you're doing and you can wake up happy, because that's what's going to keep you going. And then be open to new experiences like research and giving yourself a fair chance at enjoying that type of stuff as well. So yeah, for me, throughout residency, I was doing a lot of clinical work, and I realized that I wanted to do more of research and sort of quality improvement on a systems level, which is why I'm moving a little bit into the informatics world. So always being flexible and keeping an eye out for different things you might like, and trying different things, meeting different people. So don't ever be afraid don't ever try to push yourself in one direction if you feel like it's not working. People change their minds all the time in our field, so don't feel bad if you're not liking where you're at right now.
I love it. Well, Chris, you're an absolute wizard, man. I'm astonished at what you've been able to do and accomplish. Step one, I know it's just a score on a test, but obviously for those that have been there in the past, we know what that's like. And for those of you that are coming up to the exam, it's doable. It's something that we all get through. And there's a lot that you can do to prepare and set yourself up for success. So Chris has shared what I believe are some absolute golden nuggets here today. Would love to give you an opportunity to come back and join us again for a different webinar. I know there's probably many more things that you can share. So for today, I'd love to wrap up. There, a couple of last questions that were coming in. So I want to just shout this out so that people do know. You can go to picmonic.com, find the webinars page, click the little RSVP button, type in your email. This webinar is recorded. As much as I hate being on video and recorded, this is recorded. Chris has some great tips that if you missed, we are going to disperse this. So go to the webinars page at picmonic.com, RSVP to this. So Chris, thank you so much for taking your time out of your busy day. I know you're an incredibly busy gentleman and doctor at this point in time. So thank you for taking the time, sharing your tidbits with the world. And for everyone else, if there's any questions that you have, feel free to write into feedback@picmonic.com. Please go to picmonic.com, sign up for a free account, as Chris mentioned. You can track it out, see if it's right for you, and hopefully will help you in your upcoming journey to becoming an incredible healthcare professional. So, Chris, any last parting words before we say goodnight?
Nope. I think we touched it all. Try not to worry. Take a deep breath. Remember to take breaks. And let us know if you have any questions.
All right. Well, Chris, thank you again so much. Humbled and honored to have had the experience to do this with you, bud. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining. Everybody have a good night. See ya.
All right. Take care. Bye.